It's the end of February, and you know what that means? It means that Finish It February is over for another year, and it is time to reflect on everything that I was able to get done this month. So if you're new here, hi, I'm Claude. I'm a costume maker and a dress historian, and I'm also an avid knitter. And one of my areas of interest is the 1940s, and so I make a lot of original vintage knitting and crochet patterns. And Finish It February is an event in the knitting community, which is the brainchild of the wonderful Roxanne Richardson. And essentially what happens is once a year in February, we pause our current works in progress and get out all those UFOs, unfinished objects that have been hanging around, and just tackle them in the shortest month of the year. Now, I've done Finish It February for several years now. I found it incredibly helpful when I was working on the daisy blouse and I was slogging it through making all those individual daisies and crocheting together nearly 400 of them. But this year I was actually in a much better position in terms of works in progress that I'd abandoned than I've ever been. I only had 5 works in progress on the go. The first one was my current active project that I was working on, which was this Best Way 1940s or early 50s 2-ply lace and colour work twin set, but I'm just making the cardigan for now. We'll see if I want to tackle the jumper later as well. So that was my first work in progress. The second was this Sirdar 1980s cardigan that I'd started at the end of last year as one of my Stashbusting projects. I'm doing this long-term project where I'm trying to work through my stash and get it down to under 100 balls of wool, because that's the size that I find is manageable for me and I have the storage space for. And so I've been doing this Stashbusting project for several years now, but I kind of fell off the wagon a little bit last year when I think I just needed a bit of change and some sort of new and novel yarn in the stash. And so I ended up adding more yarn to my stash than I got rid of, and I'm trying to rectify that by working on some of the heavier weight yarn I have, largely because I do a lot of vintage project. That means a lot of 2-ply and 3-ply and 4-ply, and a heavier project would firstly be a nice change, but would also mean that I could knit through my stash a bit quicker. And so I chose this 1980s pattern that I've had for many years to use up some Aran weight wool in my stash. At the beginning of February, I think I'd finished one front of the cardigan and had made a start on the second, but I really hadn't gotten very far. My third work in progress was another vintage project. However, I'd only just started that. It was for a pair of 1940s service stockings, and I had this idea that I wanted it to be its own standalone video so that I could talk more about knitting in World War II and service knits and a lot of the patterns that we have and survive and knitting for charity, all sorts of things. So I didn't want to work on that in February because I had bigger plans for that project. Now, my fourth project is a very long-term work in progress, but it's the Beekeeper's Quilt by Tiny Owl Knits, and I've been working on this for a long time, and the logistics of that project meant that it wasn't appropriate for me to work on in February. So if you don't know, the Beekeeper's Quilt, you knit all these tiny little hexagons and you stuff them with toy stuffing or cushions filling or whatever you have. Scrap yarn I've seen people use as well. So it's a big, squishy, pillowy blanket made up of all these little individual hexagon sections. Now, I started that project before I met my partner, who we call Woody. Woody has a dog called Sagan. Sagan is a sucker for anything soft and squishy, and he also loves to dismember anything that has polyfill in. And so I had this dilemma last year about what do I do with this project, because even if I do finish it, there's no way I can just leave it out because it will instantly be destroyed by Sagan, and I can't blame him, it's his instinct. But it's a lot of work and I would kind of be gutted. So I decided to compromise and I split my time between Woody's house and my parents' house, and so I leave that project at my parents' house and it's just ticking along. It's probably going to take me 10 years to finish, and I'm fine with that. That didn't make it a good candidate to work on in Finish It February. The final work in progress I have is a pair of socks, which are the Great Paxford socks by Squid School of Vintage Knitting. And I was knitting these socks out of scrap yarn and I had abandoned them, and I couldn't remember why I'd abandoned them. I think it was something to do with yarn quantities and running out of yarn. But for the life of me, I couldn't figure out the logic of what was going on with these socks and why I'd abandoned them. Those were my 5 knitting options. for Finish It February. I also had some other tasks that I wanted to do in Finish It February. I had some ends to weave in on some mittens that I'd made for a giveaway for my Ko-fi members called the Ratioto Mitts by Cello Knits, and I'd made the decision to frog a project of mine from last year to reclaim the yarn, and I'd started reclaiming the yarn, but there was still some of it that needed unraveling and steaming and rewinding. And so the way that I like to do Finish It February is to start with the easiest project. And I think even before it was officially Finish It February, if you like, I think in the last few days of January, I started unwinding my 1930s ski jumper and steaming and rewinding the yarn so that I could use that yarn for a different vintage project I have in mind. More on that another time. This video is about works in progress. Now, the Ratioto mitts were made out of odds and ends of yarn that I had left from making my Morn cardigan by Engineering Knits. And I had knit these in November, I think, of 2024, a really long time ago. And all that they needed was the ends weaving in and blocking. And for some reason, I put them somewhere in a cupboard and I could not find them for over a year. Thankfully, I found them again when I got out all my Christmas decorations. Because I'd made them in November, I'd obviously tidied up for Christmas in 2024 and put things away. And then I didn't go back in the cupboard where I keep the Christmas decorations until December came around again last year. And that was when I found those mitts that I had lost. So that was a lovely, easy task to start Finish It February with, just weaving in, I mean, it was a lot of ends, but just weaving in a few ends, and that is my first project complete for Finish It February. I had to readjust, I wasn't very comfy. But in terms of actively knitting, I really wasn't sure what to work on. I was pretty certain that I didn't want to work on the beekeeper's quilt or the service stockings because, like I say, I had my reasons for why they were not a good fit for Finish It February. That left the Best Way Laceweight cardigan, it left the 1980s Sirdar cardigan, and it left the Great Paxford socks. And when I have a moment of indecision, I ask the audience, basically. And so I made a short video where I talked through all my options and I asked my audience to vote on what I should finish. For the Best Way cardigan, I only had a very little bit of one sleeve left to actually knit. And I'd stalled at this point because the combination of the very fine gauge, the lace repeat pattern, the colour work pattern, and the sleeve decreasing was just a little bit too much for my brain to really comfortably handle. You know, I had to really sit down and focus on that project if I was going to get that done without a load of mistakes. So I'd sort of been putting it off and I was hoping that my audience would say to work on something else, but no, they overwhelmingly voted for me to finish the Best Way cardigan first. So I knuckled in, I finished the end of the sleeve shaping on that cardigan. It was tough, but I made it through. And then the only thing I had left to knit was called the strapping. Now this was the button band essentially, and being a V-neck cardigan, it went up the front, around the neck, and back down again. Now I started work on the strapping and it used this technique that I wasn't familiar with. It looked like rib. However, it wasn't a knit one, purl one rib, it was a knit one, slip one rib. Fine. However, when you're knitting on 2 3/4mm needles with lace weight yarn, a strip this wide, it was incredibly fiddly to do. I also used the vintage instructions for how to construct the buttonholes, and I just didn't like the result. I found they were really big and gapey and sort of chunky for a cardigan that is incredibly lightweight and lacy. And I had this idea that rather than knit this button band that I was finding incredibly soul destroying and I didn't really even like the finished result of, why don't I use my knitting machine, because I have a flatbed knitting machine that I have been experimenting on and off with for a good 5 years now. Why don't I try and replicate this rib technique on the knitting machine? And so I did a lot of experimenting with mixed success. So, say hello to my Knitax Automatic 2. This is the knitting machine that I inherited from my German great aunt, Tante Ingrid. I've had this for about 5 years now, more than that, 6 years, and I have done some tinkering. I've had some help from Woody in terms of fixing it up to get running again. I've also had some mishaps, so it does come with a ribber. However, for whatever reason, the ribber needles had started to perish and rust a little bit, and so I did my best to clean them up and I soaked them in some rust remover, and they then subsequently just completely corroded, and I've tried to like hand polish them with wire wool and stuff, I just don't know. I've tried to use them since, but I think I've ruined them. They're €2 each to replace. And I'd need over 100 of them. So we're looking at like £200 to replace the needles on this knitting machine that doesn't work that great anyway. And I have sort of been fiddling with it because I've been trying to figure out whether the reason it doesn't work is user error or there is actually more wrong with it than I realise. I have had some success, so let's see if we can get it to work so I can finish the rib on my 1940s lace cardigan. The pattern for this called for 15 stitches. It's about 1 inch wide, isn't it? So really I'm looking for 1 inch wide. So if that's 15, I'd need 30 and every other. However, if I'm doubling it, I would need 15. I would need 30 stitches across 60. So I'm gonna go with the logic that we're gonna have to fold it in half. And then let's put every other stitch back, every other needle back. There we are. I know that you need to have the last ones be knits. So that looks really wide, but it's gonna shrink and it's gonna be folded in half. And so this particular model of knitting machine, can you see these brown plastic bits that move? These are called sinkers, and this is what means that I don't need any weights, I don't need a cast on comb for this particular type of machine. So it's very user friendly in that sense, in that you don't need a lot of gear. And the cast on I'm doing is called an E-wrap cast on. So under the sinker behind the latch, under the sinker behind the latch, under the sinker behind the latch, under the sinker. And crucially, I'm under the sinker at the end here. So what we're going to do now is put the yarn into the other section of the tensioner like that, and then hopefully we're going to get a cast on. Thank the Lord. Okay, the pattern calls for 22 rows and then you make a buttonhole, the handwritten instructions. So let's aim for 22 rows and see how far we get. If that makes sense, then I can compare it to the tension I've been getting. See if the lengths are equitable and stuff. Okay, here we go, 22 rows. Something's gone wrong here already. "21, 22. Okay, so let me free this and see. I've got a couple of missed stitches there and something went wrong at the end there. But then I'm going to need some waste yarn in a different colour. Some of this blue from Sagan's dog jumper. So to make a buttonhole, this is 30 stitches wide, right? So to make a buttonhole, all you do is manually, oh, that was good, wasn't it? Work you see how that didn't go under the sinkers? Need to put it under the sinkers. So what I'm doing is manually knitting with a scrap piece of yarn those 5 stitches for the buttonhole, and then I'm manually adjusting the brown sinkers. 2, 3, 4, under the sinkers there, 5, and I'll just make sure that that goes under the sinkers there like that. Lovely. Okay, there we are. Everybody's back in working position. Please, 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 please. Yes. Okay. hopefully what that's done is essentially put a little stopper in there. Yeah, you can sort of see where that gap is. And then later on, I come back and I graft the two halves together. $66. Okay, I'm not going to bother casting off. So that would be the spacing of my next buttonhole. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put this on waste yarn. I mean, that's definitely too wide. So something went wrong with my maths there. So I've done several different experiments. Obviously, you can see some of them more successful than others. This was the result of the first one. Massively too wide. Massively. This was on tension 1, and this is a bit of a mind melt for me because the tension on the knitting machine works in the opposite direction to the tension on the sewing machine. That is, on a sewing machine, the higher the number, the more tension you have. On the knitting machine, the higher the number, the bigger the stitch, so the less tension you have. So 1 is the most tension you can have on my particular knitting machine, and this was done on setting number 1, and it just looks like stocking stitch. There's hardly any rib effect. It's also massively too big. I know I got the maths wrong with that, but in theory, what I did here I think will work. I tried again. I made an attempt. I did 2 attempts at manually doing on the knitting machine what I had been doing hand knitting, in that I alternate in each row which stitch you're slipping. And I like the way this looks. I think it's a very effective mock rib. However, folded double, which I would have to do, it's really dense, it's really thick, and I just don't think it's a good substitute for this, which is sort of fluffier compared to the density of this. But also, it's going on the front of a lace cardigan. This is going to be too heavy, and it's going to mess with the front of the lace pattern. So I tried again with more stitches, and by turning the stitch, putting it on setting 2, it still didn't really improve. So then I did a little bit of waste yarn transition, and I thought, what if I just do every other stitch the way that I had seen other machine knitters do it, the way that I've got instructions for, and we'll see. So this was 7 stitches across 15 needles on setting 4, and I thought, yes, it's too narrow, I would need double this if I'm folding it like that. Not getting any buttons in there really, am I? But then I tried setting 2, and I actually think we're on to a winner here. Folded double, I think this would work. So I want to do one more sample where I'm doing 15 stitches across 30 needles, and hopefully that will give me the width I need to fold it double and end up with something comparable to the hand knit version. So here we go again. I'm running a little light on yarn here, but oh well. Do you see what I mean? And then if you sort of pull it, it does get longer, however. So is that going to mean... Oh yeah, look. Look at the difference in row gauge. Okay. Oh shit, that means I've got to do more maths. While I was eventually able to get a result that I was happy with on the knitting machine, unfortunately, the process of repeatedly doing the knitting machine action of moving the carriage from left to right injured my already very temperamental back. a little bit of an update with where I am in Finish It February. Today is February the 16th, so we're over halfway through the month now. Obviously, you can just see it behind me there. The knitting machine is still out, and I do still want to try and do the button band on my 1940s lace cardigan with the knitting machine. I do think that I will get a better effect, an effect that I'm happy with that way. However, given the injuries I've sustained, I'm really in two minds about it. Oh. And this is the difficulty of having a condition where the symptoms have a delayed onset. Because I was machine knitting like all day, 2 days even, no symptoms at all. And then the post-exertional malaise hit. Characteristically for me, it's about 48 hours later. And I was ruined. I was absolutely ruined. Oh God, and I had no idea. The reason why that makes this difficult for me is because I have no idea where the line is now. So that means I have to start at the beginning and do like 5 minutes and then wait 2 days to see whether that was too much for me. Dealing with that currently is just kind of too much to even think about at the moment. It's just too much for me. And so there's a part of me that's like, girl, just bash it out, because I don't think it would take very long once I've done all the blocking and everything to knit like 15 stitches wide or something, like a long strip. It probably wouldn't take very long. So I could probably just bash it out and like schedule it into a time where I know I've got sort of room to crash. Terrible pacing. Don't do that. Do as I say, not as I do. But I am tempted, just for the sake of Finish It February, to get it done while I am having this internal battle. I've just switched to working on this, to this one. So I have 2 fronts now of this cardigan. The fact that there's no shoulder shaping, we're having a dropped shoulder line, and it's this wide. I've got the navy blue blanket behind me. You can't see it. Oh dear. Why do you watch this YouTube channel? I do wonder. This is, so we've got a dropped shoulder, and I'm relatively broad in the shoulder, but not massively, and it hits at the roll of my shoulder. It seems like on our model here that it's like down here. Now, I haven't blocked these yet. So in terms of gauge, or tension as they're calling it, one cable pattern is 2.5 centimeters wide. So that's including that stitch there, which easily, once it's washed and blocked, I'll get that. But the only other tension it gives is for stocking stitch, and of course the rest of this is very textured, and so I am really nervous. I keep thinking this is the armhole, but it's the neck, that it's very stretchy. I'm sure it will be fine. I'm sure it will be fine. But it's also not very long. Oh, it's never straightforward, is it, knitting? I have started the back because I need something to work on whilst I'm thinking about all these decisions. But I think I still need to block the lace fronts of the 1940s cardigan. At the same time, I think I'm gonna block one of these just to make sure that it's going to be wide enough. I'm sure it will be fine. If it doesn't fit me, I'll give it away and it will fit somebody else, because it's quite a generic sort of thing. So it's not like one of my really niche 1940s knitwear projects where I'm like, oh, this didn't quite work out. Do you want it? And people are like, no. I'm sure somebody could make use of this. I could donate this to charity or whatever. Finish It February is always like this. But given that there's 12 days left to finish 2 cardigans, I'm not sure it's going to happen. The other consequence of this injury was that when you make something on the knitting machine, you cannot get an accurate gauge measurement without blocking. You have to block whatever you make because of the tension that it's under on the machine. It's often stretched wider than the finished item will be, and you're hanging it off the machine, and so it's growing longer and longer and things. Ideally, you need to wet block it. The yarn that I'm also using for that project, you need to wet block as well. Steam blocking is not enough. And so I knew I needed to wet block the finished pieces of my cardigan and wet block my button band samples to make sure that I was going to knit something the correct length and space the buttonholes properly. We are up to, I think it's now 49 consecutive days of rain in Britain this winter. The reality is that wet blocking is just not going to happen. And I had some people comment when I mentioned this before on one of my shorts about, oh, you dried something in the oven once before, why don't you try that again? And I would try it again, apart from I have so many pieces of this to block that they wouldn't all fit in the oven at the same time. And while my parents' oven goes as low as 50 degrees centigrade, Woody's oven, it says it does 50 degrees centigrade, but it also says it does 180 degrees centigrade. And, well, let's just say things come out pretty burnt pretty quickly, so I don't trust it to not set my yarn on fire. There's also complications about the cottage where Woody lives is very small, and we're short of table space or surface space, and so I would have to leave anything blocking on the floor with pins in. The dog, I don't want the dog to stand on it, I don't want the dog to lie on it and get injured. And so the solution I've come up with for this is essentially to take everything to my parents' house, block it at my parents' house and leave it there. Thanks, Mum and Dad. In the meantime, I decided to focus on knitting the 1980s Sirdar cardigan. And you know, I've really been enjoying working on that 1980s cardigan. I'd really lost my spark for knitting recently. I think I'd kind of found myself slogging through a lot of quite difficult projects, and that had really killed my motivation. And my hope had been that the discipline of Finish It February, where I'm essentially just trying to get things finished, I was hoping that that would reset things a little bit for me and I would start to feel more excited about the things I was working on. And I think with this 1980s cardigan, it has. I've done a few sessions where I've sit in front of the telly, queued up my Watch Later playlist on YouTube and just knit. And it's been really therapeutic. And it took me a little while to get my head around the cable and texture pattern for this 1980s cardigan. About halfway up the back, having knit 2 fronts, I finally had it memorised. And since then, I've been flying. I've been really loving it. Today is actually the 23rd of February when I'm filming this, so I do have 5 days left in February. However, the reason I wanted to start filming this video today, rather than like on March the 1st or whatever, is because I know I'm not going to get any of these things finished. Which means that the sum of my completed works, if you like, in Finish It February is going to be unpicking a finished cardigan and weaving in some ends. And that feels, well, it doesn't feel great. However, that's kind of not the reason why I do this. The reason why I do this is firstly so that I have an awareness of what I have. And I'm the sort of person that I really enjoy reflecting on my making practice, if you like, so that I can identify my own shortcomings or my own preferences or areas for improvement, if you like. I knew that in the past few years, I've kind of lost my love for knitting. And I think that is partly stash busting. I've talked about this a lot because the reality of stash busting is you start with the yarn and you have to make a garment to fit the yarn. I previously had only really gotten interested in knitting by virtue of the fact that I liked vintage clothes and I wanted to make my own vintage clothes. You know, it was the finished product I was after. I wasn't interested in the process of knitting the clothes. I wanted cute vintage 1940s sweaters that I couldn't buy any other way. I'm so much more aware of that now, and I think the only way that I came to that realization was from doing firstly YouTube, but also reflecting on these projects, and Finish It February has been a big part of that. So I'm trying not to feel despondent, and I'm also trying in this last week, almost, less than, of Finish It February to not rush things. Would it be brilliant to have a load of finished objects that I could show you in the video, that could go in the thumbnail, that I could rave about how brilliant my Finish It February was? Of course it would. That would make a better video than this one where I'm just sat here talking to you. But that's not my reality. It's probably not your reality. And so I want to spend this last 5 days in February focusing on what I have achieved and setting myself up for success in the future. I need to start thinking about what I'm going to do when I finish these projects, and I want to think about what I've learned from this experience this year. Because my previous Finish It Februaries were both largely about finishing the daisy blouse. This year feels totally different, and I'm still a little bit unsure of where I go from here. So shall we see if we can figure it out together? So I'm at the point where I'm shaping the shoulders for the back. At least I think I am. Nah, let's just do it. Why double check? Let's live dangerously. So, cast off 16 stitches in pattern across beginning of next 4 rows. Okie doke. Three rows left. Do I have enough? Ah, yarn chicken. Here we go. No, we're not going to make it. Ah! I have these little odds and ends from a top-down version of this cardigan or a different cardigan that I attempted. So I'm going to do that thing where you join in the middle of the row. And hopefully, which one of these do we think has more in? I think it's this one. Hopefully, between the two of these, we will cast off without needing to crack into another ball of yarn. Okay, this much left. Will it be enough to cast off my last lot of 32 stitches? Yay! Woo! Just. Oops. Ta-da! Oh. And there we have it. The back. This is where I look at it and notice I've made a mistake. But honestly, this yarn is so dark that all of that sort of just disappears. It just kind of looks like a nice squishy mess. So I'm not going to fix it. Even if I do make a mistake. I don't think I have though. And so we're on to the sleeves. Do you see that? Do you know what that means? As usual with my stash busting projects, this one has suddenly become a game of yarn chicken. So this pattern calls for 500 grams of yarn, of the suggested yarn. I have 500 grams of a similar yarn and I was like, oh, it'll be fine, I'm sure. I had 500 grams and I'd used 300 grams of it for the 2 fronts and the back. 200 grams for 2 sleeves and a button band. Should be fine, right? Apart from 50 grams of my 500 gram ball of wool. Can you see that? Lot 10. Also different design of the label. Lot 11. So I've got one ball, which is a different dye lot. Now, I mustn't get these confused. It's this one. Is it obvious? Barely. I've done the maths. I made a spreadsheet. I weighed the back, figured out how many stitches were in the back, worked out how much roughly a stitch weighs, and then times that by how many stitches there are in each sleeve, times 2. And I think I need like 170 grams. Oh, my washing machine's about to spin, sorry. I need 170 grams total for the sleeves. So I've done that thing where I've done the rib in the different dye lot shade, and then hopefully the neckband if I do that in the different dye lot shade as well. I should have enough yarn, I think. However, one of these balls of wool, either a dog got to it and picked up in their mouth and chewed the outside, or a moth got to it. So I'm having to do... So I'm losing some yarn there. So suddenly, this nice straightforward knitting project is a complicated knitting project. Had I realised this before, I probably would have knit the rib on the backs and the fronts in the different dye lot as well. But I didn't realise this before. So if it comes to it, I can put in a lifeline, chop off the bottom rib, reknit the rib and graft in the different dye lot and graft it together and reclaim that yarn to finish my sleeves. However, I don't want to do that because that's a lot of work and a lot of concentrating. Also, I think it gets to a point with the sleeves, you shape and then you continue straight until it measures an arbitrary measurement that they've given you, which depends on the size. I could always just make my sleeves a bit shorter and have like bracelet length sleeves. Is the plan, because these sleeves are knit from the bottom up. So if I run out of yarn, I don't think I'll run out of yarn before I complete the shaping. It's highly unlikely. I've definitely got enough yarn to complete the shaping. So if they're 3/4 length sleeves, they're 3/4 length sleeves. It's just always the way, isn't it? Anyway, I'm halfway through a row, as you can see, and so I need to finish this row and match my sleeves up so that I know what I'm doing. And here we are, March. So that means Finish It February is over for another year. It's certainly been a tricky one this year, I won't lie. Given that this is all I really have to show for it, and I only needed to weave the ends in on these anyway. What I will say is it was a lot of ends, and it was still quite a challenge and quite a time commitment. So I'm really pleased that I got it done, particularly because I can finally give these away to one of my Ko-fi members as a token of my appreciation for their continued support. And I think actually I should probably do another one to make up for the fact that this one took so long. So we'll see what else I can make from my stash. But I think the reality is that Finish It February, in a way, is not really about finishing things. It's about addressing works in progress or unfinished objects, UFOs. And given that I didn't have that many to begin with, it's made me feel a little bit like a fraud, because my longest sort of like put aside works in progress are still put aside. I haven't looked at the socks to see what I need to do to them. I just haven't. But that's partly because what Finish It February made me realise, I'm sorry, I have some very squeaky dogs today. Boys, what's the problem? My longest works in progress are still works in progress. However, I'd really lost motivation on my current makes, if that makes sense. I'd really was slogging through them and not enjoying knitting at all. And so forcing myself back into the rhythm of continuously working on the same project, or at least switching between a couple of them, has been really good, because it's reminded me that I do actually enjoy knitting. When I sit down and do it, I enjoy it. It's more the getting started that I've been having trouble with. The peace and quiet of the countryside. So, it's the 2nd of March today. I finished my sleeves yesterday on the 1st of March. So we ran over a little bit, and I had to knit until I ran out of wool, basically. And you can see like there's a join there. And on this one, I think, yeah, there's also another join. I literally had to use the cast on tail from this one, which was originally this long, to finish the cast off for the other sleeve. So they are going to be a little on the short side. Fine with me. This was a stash busting project, and I have to remind myself sometimes that the goal of stash busting is about the yarn more than it is about the finished product. These still need blocking. The rest of the cardigan is ready to be seamed up, is blocked, it will fit. Look how much it grew in terms of width. You know how I was like, oh, that drop shoulder's not going to be very dropped. Yeah, well, it is now. So I can sew, there's another bit of this. I just left some of the blocking upstairs, and I've done too many stairs today already, so I'm not going back up there. But like, look at the width I got across the back. You know what I mean? We're fine. So this can be seamed up, and I can do the neckband and the button band. I want to watch a refresher video from Roxanne Richardson about how to get really neat edges on button bands, because that is one of the things that always frustrates me with my hand knitting. Ahead of me is a lot of sewing up, basically, because I'm in a similar position with this cardigan. So I've blocked it now so I can get accurate gauge measurements. It's gonna be so cute. And I can do the button band on the knitting machine. I got a lot of comments that were like, you need to wet block the button band as well. I did wet block it. I've double blocked it, basically, just to reassure everybody that I'd have wet blocked it. I've been very thorough. So now I can get an accurate gauge measurement of this and do that on the knitting machine. I'm dreading it. I'm absolutely dreading it, and I don't really know why. I just want it done and wearable. I don't hate sewing up, so it's not the sewing up aspect of it. It's the physicality of the knitting machine that is making me nervous. Also, babysitting 2 Vizslas today. It's not a good time to be doing any kind of delicate, fragile work. Regardless of that, even if I had a free day today and there were no problems and I could just crack on, I don't think I would want to currently at this point, because I'm so into this project. I don't know, I'm having like a real 80s sort of moment, if that makes sense. I'm costuming a show which is set in the 80s, so I'm doing a lot of 80s research. I'm sourcing a lot of 80s things. I don't know why, it's just, maybe I'm part of the trend cycle or whatever, I don't know, but for whatever reason, I am in an 80s frame of mind. And so I'm really enjoying working on and thinking about 80s projects. I might even do an 80s sewing project. I'm enjoying it so much. And I would definitely knit another 80s pattern. I think they're so interesting from like a historical point of view. I know the 80s is only 40 years ago, but it feels historical now. So that is my Finish It February progress. I didn't do any hexie puffs and I didn't work on those stockings at all. So it's very much been, oh, hello, mister. Oh, there we go. I knew, see, this is why there's no need to stress. Okay, I'm right here. So, despite not having anything really dynamic to show you and have like a grand reveal at the end of Finish It February of all the things I finished, here it is. I feel really good about my progress and about my knitting and about my practice as a maker, I suppose. Previously, I've always had this sense of works in progress or unfinished objects hanging over me as like an obligation I should fulfill. And I don't really feel like that anymore. You know, I've got those socks that I need to figure out. When I feel like knitting some socks, I'll figure it out. I've got the stockings, which are going to be a slog. And when I want to make that video, I will get round to slogging through it, you know, for the sake of the video. And the hexie puffs are hexie puffs, and I'll keep making them over the next 10 years until I'm happy with them. Getting these cardigans progressed has been really good, and it's also, to say how much progress I've made in quite a short space of time on two really big, challenging projects, it's totally inspired me. I think I was sort of reminded of just how quickly projects come together when you actually work on them. I think when you're like knitting maybe like once a month, it's like, oh God, will I ever get this sweater finished? It's been hanging around for ages. Well, yeah, if you sit on the sofa and do 3 hours knitting with breaks, it goes a lot quicker actually. What a surprise. So I think that's what I will take away from Finish It February, is that if I want a garment, I actually have to put in the work and make the garment. If I want to have a little bit of handicraft on the go for when I've got itchy fingers, that's a different thing. You know, I need a different sort of project for that. And I need to approach these two things very differently. Not just in terms of mindset, but in terms of pacing and all that sort of stuff that I have to deal with. So I hope you've enjoyed following along with me this Finish It February. And I look forward to the Stashbusting update in March, because I get the feeling that we might be able to not only reassess the total, but knock quite a few things off. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.